Okay, the one I just finished ended on kind of an odd note. Don't ask. It doesn't matter. Taking up right where we were, the big debate, the thing that came closest to splitting the convention was the question of Congress. Because Madison's plan, supported by the large states, and hence called the large state plan, also the Virginia plan, um, had it where both houses of Congress would represent populations, so that the upper house as well as the lower would have the seats apportioned according to population, more for the big states. The small states insisted that Congress should be like it had been under the Articles and the Continental Congress, with each state being represented equally as equal political entities, hence basically one vote, one state, one vote. Okay, so sometimes they would just change the subject and go off, and then it'd come back, and this was furious. Both sides are looking for a 100-0 victory. Like, the small states won't settle for anything short of equal representation. The large states won't join unless they have the extra representation. Um, there was a delegate named Roger Sherman from Connecticut who'd been trying to get anybody to listen to him the whole time, arguing that it's not going to be all one way or all the other. And he was offering a compromise, and it took weeks for one side or the other to break down and go with it. And we'll get to that. Along the way, this is about the end of the third week of June, a delegate named Patterson with one T, from New Jersey, offered what came to be called the New Jersey Plan. And Patterson was probably what we call a localist. Some divide the convention delegates into centrists and localists. Centrists want a strong central government. Localists want to keep as much authority in the hands of state authorities as possible, and the original plan pretty much did that. Anyway, the New Jersey plan, or the small state plan, since favored their interest, it was the Articles warmed over. It was kind of a way of saying, let's go back and do what we've been supposed to be doing this whole time and revise the Articles. It was a plan that would give Congress some actual power, I think trade regulation, maybe taxation. That's what it was. So the New Jersey plan got debated for all of 3 days maybe, and then poof, it's so the New Jersey plan is briefly debated and then dropped. It would, of course, this should have been implied in saying it was the Articles warmed over, it would preserve a one-house Congress with one state, one vote. So I've seen government textbooks in the early chapters, high school government textbooks, a few college textbooks which treat these as equal. Virginia plan, New Jersey plan. And it's not. It's not at all. Okay, although there is language in the Constitution along about Article 5, I think, which is verbatim from the Articles of Confederation. It has to do with relations among the states. Okay, small point. What broke the logjam about the second week of July was that the big state delegates caved, and they agreed to Roger Sherman's proposed compromise. They weren't happy about it. Madison was furious. He believed his whole plan had just been shoved in the wastebasket at that point. But eventually they have to get a deal done. So Sherman's idea came to be called the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, and it gives us Congress almost the way it is today. He kept Madison's idea about the lower house being a portion among the states based on population. It would represent the voters, hence it would be called the House of Representatives. In the upper house, the states would be represented equally, and it wouldn't be one state, one vote. It's basically each state would have 2 votes. And this august upper house would be, they borrow a term from the ancient Roman Republic. It would be the Senate. The senators would serve lengthy 6-year terms to insulate them from the changing winds of public opinion, that sort of thing. and they would be elected by the legislatures of the states, not the voters. That was not changed until 1913. Took the 17th Amendment to do that. And they would serve staggered terms. So unless there's an unfinished term to be filled with somebody, only a third of the members would be up for reelection in any one election cycle. So the Senate was designed to be, and remains today, a kind of firewall against the excesses of democracy. And the inclusion of the Senate in the counting of a portion of delegates for the Electoral College gives the small states collectively quite a bit more clout than they would have otherwise. So, in a popular election. So we'll save that for later. So with the Great Compromise, then all you have to do is work out some problems. There are two more major compromises. I'm going to go ahead and do those and then come back to the details that they have to work out. Okay? You have the African slave trade compromise. Now, this is a compromise between, it's kind of a north-south compromise, but the term African slave trade referred to the importation of more slaves from Africa. By 1787, slavery is an embarrassment to almost all of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. They felt trapped by it. But they were ready, all but South Carolina and Georgia, with their rice plantations needing heavy and continuous reinforcements of the Africans who would die in the rice fields of disease and so forth. Everybody else, even the slave states, are prepared to give Congress authority to forbid, to outlaw the African slave trade, meaning outlaw any further importation of Africans. South Carolina and Georgia, it was a bluff. It was a bluff. They said they couldn't, they just wouldn't join unless this were protected. Nobody called their bluff. If they don't join, they're still independent countries and they're minnows in a shark tank. They can't do that. They have to have access to national markets. They have to have military protection from the Spanish in Florida and from the Indians. Wouldn't have worked. Well, so nearly everybody wants that. The other side of the compromise has to do with Southerners fearing that some future Congress might tax exports. Now, granted, that's just about the dumbest thing a government could possibly do, but hey, when did that ever stop Congress from doing anything? So there's a deal. In exchange for a permanent prohibition on Congress ever taxing exports, it was agreed that Congress would receive the authority to ban the African slave trade 20 years after the ratification of this document they're still working on. Well, it was ratified in 1788, and in 1808, in due course, Congress promptly passed legislation forbidding the African slave trade. By that time, South Carolina and Georgia had both had state laws doing the same thing, having switched their positions. One little thing, maybe I'm going to make you a little more cynical here. Maybe that's the idea. But this law banning the African slave trade, drill into the technicalities a little bit. Let's say a Coast Guard cutter intercepts a slave ship inbound with human cargo aboard. That would be seized, and whoever, the owners would not receive any profit, but the human cargo would be turned over to local authorities for disposition. Think real hard. What does that look like to you? Yeah. Okay. Oh, all right. So the African slave trade compromise. The next is the infamous 3/5 compromise. You see, the southern states had a lot of slaves. So in a state or two, maybe South Carolina, there were almost more slaves than there were free people. which I mean, and not all the African Americans were slaves. I don't think ever more than about 90%, which is a lot, but still leaves 10% free, than say the white people. And so you have that. The more population a state has, the more seats it gets in the House of Representatives. So the Southerners wanted to count the slaves as part of the population for purposes of representation. The Northern states did not. And this is going to sound insensitive because it was. Some Northern delegate to the convention challenged the Southerners, said, you don't want to represent your horses and cattle, do you? Okay. Meanwhile, there was a clause in the original Constitution, no longer operative, that all direct federal taxes must be apportioned among the states based on population. There is no practical way under the sun to ever make that work. For example, Texas has about 7% of the nation's population. If that were still in effect, the income tax would have to raise in Texas 7% of the total raised in the entire country. It's not going to work. It was never really implemented. But assuming it would be, the southern states do not want to count their slaves as population for purposes of taxation, just representation. The northern states, which had phased out, had abolished slavery outright, or were in the process of phasing it out, or soon would be, they want to count the slaves for taxation purposes, but not population. How do you fix that? You don't. You throw up your hands and you say, heck with it. And that's what they did. The 3/5 compromise. And by the way, the word slave only appears in the Constitution, I believe, or slavery only appears in the Constitution in the 13th Amendment, which abolishes it. It does not appear in the main body. They tiptoe around it. That for purposes of both taxation and representation, when they count the people every year in the census, every 10 years census, constitutionally mandated, they would count the entire free population, plus it says delicately 50%, no, 60% of all other persons. Now, it's been astutely pointed out that it refers to the enslaved population as persons, thus conferring on them at least the dignity of being human beings, which I don't think we see that before that. So it's not all just one-sided. So New Englanders were furious with this as the years went by because this grotesquely overrepresented white Southerners. They get to vote on members of Congress and are represented as if there are almost twice as many of them, because they're counting the Africans as part of the population without representing them at all. So the odious, noxious 3/5 compromise. That leaves the judicial branch. Madison actually argued against having a judicial branch. He figured the states, the laws mostly are going to be state laws anyway. Why do you need a national judicial branch? But there was controversy about it, and Madison lost. So the convention in Article 3 authorizes a judicial branch. That's the federal courts. It's short. It's only 2 paragraphs. It's an afterthought. It's an afterthought. They're tired. They're running low on money. They just want to go home. And the lack of air conditioning, I've always thought, you could sit in an air-conditioned room in a deep padded chair and argue till the cows come home. But if you're in that hot room in Philadelphia and the sweat's running down the small of your back, you're sooner or later say, I don't care. Just write something down. Let's be done with this. Well, it establishes a Supreme Court, and such inferior courts as Congress shall from time to time ordain and establish. Almost everything about it is left up to the Congress. The number of justices on the Supreme Court is up to Congress. It has not been changed except one brief change in the late 1860s since 1810. But the number is not in the Constitution. And the whole inferior court system is up to Congress to structure. It does specify the original jurisdiction of the court. What cases would go directly to the Supreme Court without coming through an appeals process? That's it. So they're through. They're about through, about ready to go home, and I'm going to do that in the next part, whatever that is.